Good morning. My name is Matt Stone. I'm so glad to be in worship with you. I'm particularly excited because of what today represents, because it's confirmation. I told our students that I would cut my normal 75-minute sermon down to 70 minutes, so you're welcome for that. But I'm excited about what's going to happen here in a few minutes. And I want to go ahead and tell you that Miles Barnes, who's our Director of Student Ministries, he and I are going to split the message today. So I'm going to share a few words, then I'm going to invite Miles to come share a few words that frankly are a little bit more aimed at our confirmation students, but the rest of us are going to listen into it, and I think that'll be really special, and I'm looking forward to it. We're actually in the second week of a series called Becoming, as we look at what does it mean for us to become better and deeper followers of Jesus, better and deeper disciples of Christ. And we started that journey last week with kind of setting the stage with some questions. We talked about how sometimes in life having all the right answers takes a backseat to asking the right questions. And so we started that journey with, do I believe that I'm a child of God? Do I believe that the work of Christ on the cross applies to me? Do I believe that God has claimed me? Right? It's at the foundation of my identity. And we talked about these questions that we're going to explore over the next couple of weeks. And I want to remind you that the questions, the purpose there is twofold. One, they're to invite us to think about our relationship with God. Sometimes we let things just happen. But these questions are intended to break us out of the habit of just letting life happen and to explore, kind of do a self-examination, what's going on in me. The second thing that I think is really important with each of these questions as we make our way through the series is their intent is not to cause shame. Their intent is to produce growth. Right? At some point along the line, we're going to run into a question that you look at and run it through the lens of your own life and realize perhaps there's more that I could do here. The purpose here isn't to shame us. The purpose here isn't to make us feel guilty. I don't think Jesus went to the cross so that we could live lives covered up by shame and guilt. Jesus goes to the cross to free us from those things that keep us from being who God made us to be. These questions are intended to help us explore who is it that God made me to be as a follower of Jesus, and how can I live that life more fully. So as we look at the second week, or the second question this week, that's where we're headed. And I think I've said something like this before. Behavior reveals belief, right? Behavior reveals belief. And I'll give you a hypothetical that is not at all related to my home and my family, not at all related to my home and to my family. If, hypothetically speaking, you walked into your child's room and said, would you clean your room, please? And your child hypothetically, not at all a real world scenario, if your child hypothetically said no, that's the behavior. The behavior is, no, I don't want to. Then the belief that underlies that behavior is the child, hypothetically the child, might think they're in control. Behavior reveals belief. This is something that's true not for children alone. This is perhaps even more true for us as adults. And we don't have to look too deep or think too long about our culture today, about our nation today, about Christianity in America today to realize that we struggle with this. The evidence will come when we examine our own lives about how different we look than the people around us. How different does our life look from the lives of the people who don't go to church next door? Do we make different decisions? Right? Do we spend money differently? Do we speak to each other differently? Do we engage the world around us differently? Do we show up to work differently? Does my life look any different because of what I believe? Or does my behavior reveal that I don't believe really any differently than the world around us? If the answer to that is my life doesn't look any different, then we are dangerously close to living what I call a life of functional atheism. In other words, we function as though God doesn't exist. We proclaim Jesus Christ, but then our lives look neither different nor do they change over time because we're acting as though, we are behaving as though God doesn't exist. We can't very well proclaim Christ as Lord and go on living as though God doesn't exist. That's just not how it works. So the second question, again, not to produce shame and guilt in us, the second question to help us grow, to help us identify what are some of the ways that I can become a better follower of Jesus. The second question is, does my relationship with God change the way that I live? And there's some incredible stories throughout Scripture that reveal this truth to us. I'm just going to look at one, but I want to look at like 8 today. But I'm just going to look at, I'm going to look at 2, but I want to look at 8. And the first one is, or really both of these stories are stories that you may have learned as a child, all right? If you grew up in church, then you may have learned these stories as a child. And what's great about them is we're a little bit familiar with them, and what's hard about it is we're a little bit familiar with them. Because a lot of times with stories that we learn as children, we forget to go back and run those stories through the lens of adulthood or through the lens of the growth that we've experienced over the last 10, 15, 20 years. And actually later this year, we're going to do a series where we look at some of the childhood Bible stories through an adult lens and discern, did we pick up the full value of that story as kids? But that's a different sermon. So the story that we're going to look at today is in Daniel chapter 1 and Daniel chapter 3, if you want to follow along. Daniel's story begins with Nebuchadnezzar, which is not the name of a ship in the Matrix. That's the name of a king in Babylon, but that's a different story too. Nebuchadnezzar comes to Jerusalem, conquers Jerusalem, tears down the temple, and carries all the Jews out of Israel and into Babylon. And when they arrive in Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar gets his kind of palace court together, and he says, hey, bring me some of the unblemished men. I don't know what that means, but that seems bizarre. He says, bring me the cream of the crop. Bring me the best of the folks that we just exiled away from their homeland. And so 4 guys show up. One of them's name is Daniel, one of them is Shadrach, one of them is Meshach, and one of them is Abednego. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And what Nebuchadnezzar tells them, he doesn't ask them, he tells them, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to feed you the best of what Babylon has to offer. I'm going to teach you the best of what Babylon has to offer because you're going to be a shining example of how great Babylon is. He's not asking, he's telling. Daniel's response, I think, is fascinating. Daniel goes to the guy that's in charge of him and says, hey, about this diet, about all of the meats and the wines that you want to feed us, I kind of don't want to. Daniel says, my faith leads me to eat differently. And that sounds like a small thing, but consider what Daniel's doing. He's standing up to the greatest power on the earth at that time, the Babylonian Empire. And he says, I don't want to eat your food. My faith is leading me to a different behavior. And the guy that's supervising him says, hey, I don't really have a problem with that. But if you show up scrawny and weak in a couple weeks, then Nebuchadnezzar's going to have my head. And I don't want any part of that. So Daniel says, well, I'll make you a deal. Give me 10 days. Feed me according to my faith for 10 days. Feed the rest of the guys who aren't Jewish, who you're also training up, feed them according to your diet, and then we'll compare the two. And if we look scrawny and weak at the end of the 10 days, we'll eat what y'all are wanting us to eat. But if we look healthy and strong, then we're going to keep eating according to the laws of our faith. And so they do it. And 10 days later, it says that Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego show up better and fatter, which I think is funny because that's good. He says better and fatter, which means God has provided. They have eaten this meager diet as opposed to the finest foods in the Babylonian Empire. These 4 faithful men have allowed God to provide for them, and it turns out it was better for their life. It's an extraordinary example, I think, small but extraordinary, of allowing our faith to lead us to live differently, to behave differently. A couple chapters later, in Daniel chapter 3, you should go read Daniel 2, by the way, if you have some extra time. In Daniel chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar comes up with a great idea. He says, okay, I'm going to build a 90-foot tall statue, and I'm going to make everybody worship it because this statue is a god. And he declares, anytime that the horn is blown in Babylon, the whole country is going to turn and they're going to bow down and they're going to worship this statue. And so Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, the first time the horn blows, of course, don't bow down and worship because they worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They worship the God who said, there are no other gods. I'm the God of heaven and earth. And so some folks tattle on them because that's what people tend to do is they tattle on Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Nebuchadnezzar loses his mind, calls them to the palace and says, look, if you'll just fall down right now and worship this golden statue, we'll forget this ever happened. And I want you to hear how Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego responded. This is what they say. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered the king, oh, Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to present a defense to you in this matter. I love this. We don't need to defend ourselves, Nebuchadnezzar. If our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire and out of your hand, O king, let him deliver us. Nebuchadnezzar, when he loses his mind, says, anybody who doesn't bow down and worship this statue, I'm going to throw them in a furnace of blazing fire, which burns, by the way, between 1,500 and 1,800 degrees. It's not a little fire, it's a big fire. And these guys come to Nebuchadnezzar and say, look, we're not going to worship your God because we worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And if you throw us in the fire and God chooses to deliver us, great. And if you throw us in the fire and God chooses not to deliver us, okay. We are going to allow our faith, our belief, to determine our behavior without exception. They go on and they say, but if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods and we will not worship the golden statue that you have set up. Nebuchadnezzar absolutely loses it and says, you know what? I know the furnace burns at 1,800 degrees. Make it 7 times hotter. And he has the guys thrown in. It's so hot that when they open the furnace door, the guards who are trying to usher Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the furnace die. But somehow Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego make their way into the furnace. They close the doors, and then Nebuchadnezzar's sitting there looking at them, and he says, hey, didn't we throw 3 guys in there? And all of his palace says, yeah, we threw 3. And he says, well, there's 4. And one of them looks like a son of God. Now, that's a different sermon. That's Jesus, but that's a different sermon. So we'll deal with that later. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, in the middle of this 14,000-degree furnace, are not burned up. Their hair is not singed. Their body is not burned. Their clothes are not burned. And Nebuchadnezzar says, he opens the gate, and he says, hey, guys, come here. Hey, come here. Which I like the image of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego just hanging out in the fire, and Nebuchadnezzar saying, hey, come here real quick. So they come out of the furnace. He says they don't even smell like smoke. That's how much they were protected. That's the degree of God's deliverance, that they don't even smell like a furnace. Nothing was harmed in them. Nebuchadnezzar goes on to make a declaration that nobody can blaspheme against the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he goes on to say, if anybody does, we'll tear them limb from limb. So I think he was pretty serious about it. Isn't it fascinating that the powers of the world try to say to the people of God, you must live this way. But when the people of God live according to their faith and not according to the world, God's protection shows up and the world around them is transformed. It wasn't Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego who were lost that day. It was Nebuchadnezzar who was transformed on that day. Friends, does your relationship with God change the way that you live? Is it the engine that drives transformation in your life, or is it the engine that drives a sideshow add-on to your life? Does your relationship with God change the way that you live, or does it merely add to what you think you know about the Bible? Right? Is your family different? Do you talk to your family differently? Do you speak to them different? Do you treat them different because of your faith? Do you spend time together differently because of your faith? In your neighborhood, when somebody's in crisis, do they come to you or do they come to your family because they know about your compassion, because they know that you are a servant and that you will love them through whatever the crisis is? Are you spending more time with God today than you did last year? Are you spending time with God today in such a way that God's gentleness and kindness and patience and goodness is more evident in your life today than it was last year? Right? Do you stand up for different things? Or maybe even more importantly, do you stand up differently for the things that you believe in? After all, if we stand up for the right things in the wrong way, friends, we cannot claim righteousness. Our relationship with God is the engine that drives transformation in our life. Does your relationship with God change the way that you live? If the answer to that is no, don't hear condemnation and judgment. If the answer is no, my relationship with God hasn't changed my life, I hope you will hear an invitation to recommit yourself to following God in such a way that the world around you is transformed. And if the answer to that is yes, by the way, if your relationship with God is changing the way that you live, then for the love of the people of God, teach us how to do it. Show us how you have connected belief and behavior because I believe this is one of God's greatest hopes for the people of God.